Back to our application then. There is one area, the recipes, which we haven't migrated to NGRX yet. And that is what I want to do now. And for this, in the recipes folder, I'll start by adding a store folder. And in that store folder, I want to add a recipe reducer.ts file, a recipe.actions.ts file, and also already a recipes effects.ts file, because we will certainly need all three things. Now let's start with the recipe reducer. And in there, you learned it's basically a function, so we will have to export a function here. And that's the recipe reducer function, or whatever you want to call it. And just as before, it is a function which will receive a state and an action, and then you have to return a new state, a new state in there. Now, also just as before, of course, we want to have an initial state, and I also want to define the structure of my state, so how the state will look like. For that, I'll export an interface, which is my state for this part of the application, so my recipe state, so to say. And now, how does the state for recipes look like? Well, if we have a look at the recipes service, we see in the end, we're only interested in recipes. We managed that thus far through the recipes changed subject, which we use to emit a copy of our recipes. But therefore, in the end, this recipes array, that is our relevant state for the recipes. So in here, in my state for the recipes part of my NGRX store, it makes sense to have the recipes array, and this will be of type recipe array. So you need to import that recipe model here. Now that describes how the state will look like for this part of the app. Let's now set up the initial state, and that will be an object of that type, so of that state type we just defined. Hence, we need a recipes array, and you could start with some recipes here, but I will initialize this to be an empty array initially. So that's the first step. Now, obviously, we also need some actions to deal with our recipes. And which actions would that be? Well, we have actions for setting multiple recipes at once. For getting is not an action, we do this with select. So we have actions for adding a recipe, and we also have actions for updating a recipe and deleting a recipe. We'll also need actions for fetching recipes from a server and for storing recipes on a server. So let's go to the recipe action file, and let's maybe start with the simple actions we have here. So the actions related to setting recipes, so that we can see something as quick as possible. So I will add set recipes here, and we'll give this prefix, recipes, that's the feature area, and then set recipes. Of course, the exact string value here is totally up to you. We'll also need to import that action interface from @ngrx store, so that we can create our action classes. And for now, I will create one class here, the set recipes class, which will, of course, implement the action interface, and which therefore requires a read-only type, which is just set recipes. Now, set recipes, as the name suggests, of course, will be responsible for, well, guess what, setting some recipes, and hence we will definitely need a payload here, which can now be stored through the constructor, and that payload here will just be that array of recipes which I want to set. For that, of course, we need to import recipe here from the recipe model. Last but not least, let's create such a union type already, so that we can conveniently add a type assignment to the action we're getting in our reducer. And that would be the recipes actions. Right now, simply set recipes. Whoops, and it's of course exported type. Okay, so that's the first action we need. Now in the recipe reducer here, we should add logic to set recipes. So later we will have multiple actions, hence a switch statement makes sense to switch on the action type. Side note, I also of course want to use my initial state here for initializing the state. And on the action, I also want to be clear about the type of the action. For that, we can import everything as recipes actions from the store from the recipe actions file. And hence here the type for the action we're getting in the reducer is recipes actions dot recipes actions. Now in the switch statement, this is the action type we're checking. The first case I want to handle is recipes actions dot set recipes. And of course I will also add a default case where I just return my state unchanged. But back to the recipes set recipes case, there I also want to return an object, or we have to return an object. But again, the goal is here to first copy the existing state, and now with that being copied, override the recipes in there by taking the recipes we find in the action payload, because the action payload here of course has an array of recipes. So here I will just use the spread operator to get my action payload. This will pull out all the elements from the recipes array I'm getting and add these recipes here to this recipes array of the new state. So that's the reducer and action setup. As a next step, let's make sure we dispatch set recipes once we have our recipes. And of course, let's make sure that we select these recipes to show them on the user interface. Dispatching for now will be done in the data storage service. There we do fetch the recipes. And once we have them, right now we're calling recipes service set recipes. That's not what we'll do. Instead, now we can remove the off service, by the way. We don't need it here anymore. Instead, now I want to inject my store here, like this. And this needs a generic type. NGRX store is, by the way, of course, the package from which you import it. And I can also clean up some other imports now that I have a look at it. But that's, of course, not the main goal here. Instead, the store needs to be imported. It's a generic type. And therefore, now we need to get our app state here, even though we're not selecting in this class. Now, for this, we first of all should update our app reducer. Because right now it only knows the shopping list and auth area. Well, that is about to change though. Let's import everything as from recipes from the recipes store recipe reducer. Now we should add recipes as a slice in our global state here and reference from recipes state. And of course that means that in the app reducer here I also will add recipes and then from recipes recipe reducer here. With that, the global application reducer is updated, and back in the data storage service we can now import from that reducer. So import everything as from app from that global store app reducer, and then we have from app state here as the type, as the generic type our store will eventually resolve to. However, I only need the store here to, of course, dispatch. So here, once we got the recipes, we can call this store dispatch. And now we also need the recipes actions to dispatch such an action. So I import everything as recipes actions from, one level up, from the recipes folder, the store folder, and from there, the recipe actions file. With the recipes actions imported here in the data storage service, let's create a new recipes action, and that would be the set recipes action to which I pass the recipes we got from the server. So now we're dispatching this set recipes action. Now we need to change the places where we're interested in the recipes. And that is the case in the recipe list component. So in there, let's now also inject our store, which is of type store. And again, for that, I have to import store from @ngrx store. And now I want to add my app state by importing from app from the app reducer. Then here it's from app state like this. And now here, instead of subscribing to recipe changed on the recipes service, I rather use the store and select the recipes area. However, there I don't get a list of recipes. Instead, I get an object which has a recipes key. I get the state slice of my recipes area. But with pipe and map, we can easily transform this. Map is imported from RxJS operators, of course. So we can easily transform this now. We get our recipes state. And what I want to return here is in the end just my recipes. Well, we can simply add map like this. Pull out the recipes, return them to the next step in line. We could also get rid of that get recipes called here. Now with that change, we can also remove the injected recipe service here in the recipe list. Now let's give this a try. Let's save that. And here in our application, if I now fetch my recipes, they do show up here. However, I'm getting an error if I try to select one, which makes sense because keep in mind that the rest of the app still tries to access recipe data from the recipes service, but there our recipes are no longer loaded into because we're now loading them in our NGRX store. And hence at the moment, only those parts of the app will work where we do access our recipes from the store. So it's time to also adjust other parts of the application.